How do you pronounce your last name?
Guys, like, hey, you guys.
Okay, here we go. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet. We are in surge mode. We've been in surge mode as a species for let's say a century, but really the last 40 years, essentially my life. We're in pandemic mode still. Several billion people are still not safely vaccinated. It's hard to believe, but it's the reality. And even among those who are vaccinated and boosted, as the president discovered this week, we're still at risk. So that's a brewing emergency that's not gone away. It's an overheating planet. Historically, humans are experiencing temperatures outside the range of modern history. The patterns of flood and drought are changing. Our exposure to those hazards is exploding. We keep moving into flood zones and hot zones, as journalists like Abraham Lustgarten and others have, and scientists like Beth Tellman have shown the world. So there's clearly an emergency of sorts. We'll be talking about that a little later, this question of climate emergency, of what to do and think about it. But right now, we're going to focus a little bit on water. And I'm really pleased to connect with Erica Sanderson and with Erica Gies. Erica's book, her website, Slow Water, as she was reporting the book, is fantastic. And now here's the book, Water Always Wins, which is true in so many ways. We're, as you know, we're vesicles for water. We don't have access to it. We're in deep trouble. And when it's dynamically active, we're also in deep trouble. So first of all, it's wonderful to be with you. I'm coming to you from rural Maine. I've moved up here now full time, and I'm borrowing my sister-in-law's bandwidth because our house is sort of in the woods, and we either have to cut down some trees or to get our Starlink system to see the world better, or wait till we have a wire. And so here we are. I'm in Penobscot territory and appreciate the landscape all around us. It's been tended for centuries, millennia by others, and it's a wonderful place to be. So I wanted to check in first with you in terms of where you are and how you are. Erica, how have you been? You've been on quite a journey, reporting journey these last several years.
Yeah, I'm good. I'm currently in Victoria, British Columbia, which is where I spend part of my time. I'm also in San Francisco. And we, unlike the East Coast and much of the country, are having kind of a coolish spring and summer. So we're having a different sort of climate weirdness.
I will say that's true where I am now too. The Northeast is generally getting wetter while the Southwest and it's getting drier. So I've written about this issue of there's no one lives in the average climate, which makes the communication challenge even greater. So Eric Sanderson, Wildlife Conservation Society, senior ecologist, one of the most creative thinkers on sustainability from a systems level that I've ever encountered. Your Mannahatta project alone, I think, which most people know you through, is a spectacular achievement. We'll talk about that in a minute. Where in the world are you?
I'm on Minnowitz, or City Island, as we like to call it, in the Eastern Bronx. I'm in New York City and in my little home office, and so glad to be with you and Erica. Thank you for having me.
City Island is a really cool place. Have you lived there for a long time? I didn't realize that.
I have, yeah. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, aka the Bronx Zoo, and when they recruited me 24 years ago now, which seems like a long time, from the Bay Area where I was living, the zoo owned some apartments on City Island, so I landed here, and then after a while bought a little bungalow, and that's where I am now.
I just didn't know. An old friend of mine who's now departed, Richard Meyer, a great folk singer and songwriter, lived there, and I visited him a few times. And it's kind of cool. It shows, it just describes City Island a little bit and how it relates to the issue you think about.
Yeah, well, New York City, as you know, Andy, is a city of neighborhoods, and City Island is probably the archetype of a neighborhood. It's 1.5 miles long, 4 blocks wide at the widest point. You can stand on the street outside my house and see the water on either side. There are these little beaches at the end of every street. People say it's Nantucket Bronx style. um, for those of you from the West Coast, it feels a little bit like Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco, in the sense that these large, these Italian seafood restaurants with big neon signs, and you get these like ginormous meals. Enough food for 3 days or something.
I actually realized I could show it on your Welikia map, I think.
Yeah. Yep, it's over there. It's about as far north and east as you can go and still be in New York City. And in fact, for a long time, before the Eastern Bronx became part of New York City, it was part of the town of Pelham, and they voted in 1895. And at the last minute, the city promised the City Islanders a bridge, which they'd been wanting for a century and a half, and so they voted to be part of the city. So
yeah. So I always like to kind of start off the question, Erica, for you first. And don't take this as having to tell your whole life story, but how did you become who you are so far? In other words, what pulled you to the water story? What got you into writing, and then what pulled you into the water story?
Well, I've always loved writing and reading. My parents actually didn't allow us to watch television, which I found to be a great hardship. But instead, I was left with books, and now I'm grateful. And in terms of water, I grew up in California, and water has always been irregular in California. We've always had wet years and dry years, and frequently have droughts of one kind or another. And my childhood, there was a drought, and we had lectures at school assemblies about how to conserve water, and we took water conservation measures around our house. And so I think water is a preoccupation of many Californians. So I don't think I'm unusual in that. And then also my family did a lot of camping and hiking when I was a kid. We didn't have a lot of money, and that was our fun. And I kind of made it a point of swimming in any body of water I came across, from the Pacific Ocean to high altitude lakes with ice still floating in the middle. And so, that kind of viscerally connected me with water. And I think we all have that. Like, almost everyone I talk to has some beloved water body that has meant something to them in their life. And, we tend to forget about that and separate that when we live in developed countries where water comes to us through our taps. But that water that we love is the same water. And so I think that's kind of an important thing to keep in mind when thinking about water. And
so dive into the actual book here. So what drove you to get so involved that you really scoured the world for both the bad stuff and for stories of kind of what I love about the book is, you start out with water always wins, but that doesn't mean we lose, essentially. So what got you in that journey, and what were some of the key insights?
Well, I think, my interest in water led me to cover it as a journalist. I was writing about science and the environment, and I was writing a lot about renewable energy. Well, I will backtrack for a moment. When I first started reporting about the environment, I love animals, and I was pitching an editor some story about conservation of a particular critter. And he said, "Nobody cares about that."
Oh no.
And so what I realized what people have to care about is energy and water. They're both kind of wonky subjects, or they can be, but they're critical to everything that we do. So anyway, I did renewable energy for a while, and then I spent a bit of time covering the water energy nexus, which is the amount of energy used to move and clean water, and the amount of water required in generating energy. And at that point, I just realized, water is so fascinating. And the more I learned about it, the more intriguing it was, and the more fascinating things it was getting up to. And so I started focusing on water in my reporting more and more. And I've covered a lot of aspects of water, during my reporting, such as desalination and water pollution, all kinds of issues. But I started realizing that one facet of the water story was really not getting enough attention, in my opinion. And that is water's kind of natural patterns and natural hydrology and the incredibly dramatic ways that we have interfered with that. So if you consider humans have actually filled in 87% of the world's wetlands, filled in and built upon or planted upon 87%. We've intervened on 2/3 of the world's largest rivers. And the area of our cities, the pavement covering land, which prevents water from soaking into the land, has doubled just since 1992. So these are incredibly vast impacts on altering natural hydrology. And so it's true that climate change is bringing more dramatic floods and droughts. Every degree Celsius increase in temperature, the atmosphere can hold 7% more water vapor. So that both creates these bigger deluges and also, sucks more water out of soil and plants in dry areas. But a significant part of it is our development choices, and that is urban sprawl, industrial agriculture, and the concrete ways in which we have tried to control water.
Concrete ways, literally.
Yeah, like dams, levees, stormwater drains under cities. And that's the problem. That's what I have come to realize by following all these people around the world that I call water detectives. Those are engineers, landscape architects, ecologists, biologists, city planners. Basically, in our attempts to control water, we haven't given it enough space. We have taken so much. Think of those 87% of the wetlands that we've taken away. So it's not surprising that we're having these floods and these terrible droughts. And droughts, and I think the flooding aspect is kind of common sense. If you have pavement, the water can't soak into the ground, so it's going to flood in your habitat. But the drought is caused by the same phenomenon in many places, because when water is allowed to filtrate into the groundwater system, which is, by the way, like 98% of all liquid fresh water on Earth is underground, that water supplies streams through the dry season and supplies wetlands. And so, in the West, we tend to think of streams as only running in the winter. But in fact, a lot of them did run year round because they were supplied by groundwater. But because of all of our interventions, we've interfered with that. So that's a story that I feel like a lot of people don't really understand. And I wanted to try to bring that to people's attention.
And I'm showing the last time you were on the show was after Ida, the remains of Hurricane Ida swept over New York City. And we had one of those unprecedented flash flood events. And it was pretty clear from the discussion and from what scientists were showing, the rain was astonishing, 3 inches in less than an hour and more. But it was the catchment. It was the changes in the landscape. And this gets to the detective. We have Eric, who is one of those detectives.
Yes.
Here. But it was so wrenching to see the human cost of this. The video, I won't show the video now, but the scene, the NYPD officer who was trying to dive into that basement apartment, and the door was, held back by the water, and a couple and a baby drowned. And we all shout climate emergency, and this gets to that, what is the emergency? What are the causes of it? And some of it's about CO2, but some of it's about where and how we built and the lessons you just described. Eric, could you take us through your journey toward being a sort of a detective, peeling back from the modern Manhattan into what was there beforehand and the like?
Sure. And we're working on the rest of the city now, Andy.
That's
so
right.
all 5 boroughs. But yeah, I got this job 24 years ago at the Wildlife Conservation Society in New York, and my job was to bring sort of ecosystem and landscape thinking to our wildlife conservation activities, which was taking me all over the world. But I kept flying back to New York City because that's where I lived, which was brand new to me. And I was sort of reading about the history and the ecology of this place. And one day I was in the Strand, which is this, amazing used bookstore downtown on 12th Street. And I was thumbing through the New York section, and I saw this amazing book called Manhattan and Maps that shows all these old maps of New York City, many of which aren't very well known, including this one from the American Revolution, the British headquarters map, which is, in the original, it's 10 feet long and 3 feet wide. It's, at a one to like an inch to a mile scale. It's really such an extraordinary map, pen and watercolor done by hand, all the way up Manhattan, and showing all the streams and all the wetlands, like the entire extent of New York City back then was just City Hall Park. And then after that, there was like a little suburban section in the Bowery. And then after that, it was just, countryside. And the military planners for the British Army, they needed to know where the streams and the hills were and the beaches and so forth to plan their troops. And so they made this amazing map. And I was able to take that map and put it in the computer and georeference it to the modern city in such a way that I could figure out where the old streams were and where the old shoreline was, which then, of course, allowed you to see, what's been filled in, how much, Manhattan's 25% bigger now than it was, 200 years ago. Ultimately, we added in more information and were able to actually sort of drive the landscape modeling back to 1609, to a few hours before Henry Hudson arrived in 1609, sort of setting in motion the history that made New York City. And it turned out that I worked for a wildlife conservation organization, but it turns out there was like amazing wildlife in New York City. Like, if it was still like it was, we would make it into a national park, and people come from all over the world to see the amazing natural resources of Manhattan and the New York City region. Which it turns out that's not a complete accident. A lot of cities are in very high biodiversity areas because wildlife likes the thing we like, and vice versa, including water, including water, lakes, streams, freshwaters, wetlands, all the things Erica was talking about. I can tell you how that worked out. And, you would think that it was all kind of wiped out and it's all been replaced by the storm drain and sewer infrastructure. But when you get a big climate event like Hurricane Ida, which is, much larger than the engineers who designed the current storm drain system ever envisioned, the water goes into the low places again. And so, so that's one track out of my work, is to sort of understand the way that the old hydrology, the ancient hydrology of New York City is still affecting our modern hydrology, and in some sense is reemerging as we move, further into the 21st century and into climate change.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's something that I found around the world. There are people doing this kind of work, sort of a historical forensic ecology, trying to understand, because this, paving and burying of streams and wetlands is incredibly common, and most cities around the world, if not all, have, the vast majority of their natural streams underground. But like Eric says, they haven't gone away. They're still there. And when high flows come, they seek their historical places. So that kind of mapping can be a guide for people who are looking for ways to make space for water again within our human habitats.
Yeah. Well, and I had a personal experience. I live on a little tiny hill on City Island, Schofield Hill. It's 40 feet high. And yet that night, the night of Ida, our basement flooded, and it had never flooded like that before. And so, my wife and I were up at 2 a.m. bailing. Nothing as bad as, other people. Nobody drowned here. It was only a few inches, but still it was kind of shocking. And we got, I think, 6 inches of rain in about 3.5 hours that afternoon and evening that night. And that's a month and a half of rain in, less than a day. And, basically our backyard turned into a pool, a vernal pool. And then that, moved up against the foundation and then came into our basement. So anyway, I was paying attention like all New Yorkers were in the days after Ida. And, there were a lot of news reports about where people died. And I started mapping them onto our historical reconstructions of the city. And, it turned, there were these people that drowned in a place that was Rock Hollow Pond, a pond that, was filled in 1906. And of course, the people that were living there completely forgotten, or didn't even know that it was once a pond, except that it turned out that neighborhood tended to flood all the time. Or, I don't know, people maybe saw the video. There was this amazing video of like a flash flood going into the subway station at 28th Street. And that subway station is dug into a wetland, that you can see on the British headquarters map. So, You know, like if you dig a hole in a wetland and then you add a lot of water and then water on, on the impervious surfaces on the buildings and the streets. So, it's trying to get away as fast as it can into a hole. Well, that's how you get a flash flood. That's like the definition of a flood.
Yeah, when the show I did after Ida was also had Andrew Krushevitz from Columbia's IRI. I'm not going to translate that. Yeah. And he's leading a NASA funded project for global flash flood warning. And the thing he emphasized is flash floods. People don't understand flash floods can happen anywhere. It can happen on a hill, as you said, because it's all about the volume of rain over time and the capacity of the land to take it away. And so he said, it makes it a special challenge. He said, even in New York City, a lot of the post hurricane, 10 years ago, 11 years ago, oh my God.
Yeah, Hurricane Sandy.
Oh my God, there's so many. Hurricanes, so much of the focus became the coast, it's like coastal flooding. And suddenly this was like one of those sort of in the back door kind of invasions. Flash flooding can happen everywhere.
Yeah, well, of course, that's the big worry, Andy, is, Sandy was mostly a coastal event without a lot of rain, right? So you had like storm surge and that sort of thing. So that was, for me, that's really all about the salt marshes and the barrier beaches. Ida was the other thing, it's more rain, less surge. So it was more about the uplands and the streams and the freshwater wetlands. But the combined event, which is, completely conceivable, where it's both, storm surge and, intense rain, that's really going to be a big problem. That's going to be very difficult.
And in your travels, Erica, there's quote unquote developed countries and there's developing countries. And I don't know if you have your own way of distilling how this challenge, the shape of the challenge in those two different landscapes, because what we're talking about with New York City or Blessem, Germany, is an area that for centuries built into a zone, built a lot of stuff, and lost that through disaster amnesia or just lack of awareness, the realities of the hazard. Mm-hmm. In developing countries, tell us about the two kinds of lessons there.
I mean, every place is specific. Every place has its own geology, ecology, and culture. And so a solution that might work would be unique. But one thing I think, rather than like developed and developing, I might talk about worldviews. And so like the dominant worldview, the Western or European worldview, which has been exported around the world via colonialism, is this kind of standard model of development that really has a control attitude toward water. And I go into the book about, what that's rooted in. Ultimately, like the book of Genesis, man shall have dominion over the earth, and which implies that everything else is there for humans, right? It's a human supremacist attitude. And I'm not picking on Christians. It's just that the Judeo-Christian model is, basically the ethos that has been exported around the world with colonialism. And
I'm showing the term hydrocolonialism from the book.
Yes. So hydrocolonialism, as this source, Kelsey Leonard, was talking about, is basically the way in which like the IMF and the World Bank like went around the world telling poorer countries like, okay, what you really need is a dam. You may have this kind of sustainable way of managing your water, but what you need is a dam because that's what we think is the best. And, we're going to give you a ton of debt that's going to be around your neck forever so that you can build this dam. And so that's, I think, this attitude that human needs are most important. What it means is that you're kind of locked into this single-minded problem solving. Like, we're flooding here, so we need to build a levee or we need to build a seawall. And of course, that has environmental justice issues because the people across the way who can't afford the wall, then more water is going to them. Similarly with the dam, we need water, so let's build the dam, we'll have a big reservoir. Right. There was a really interesting 40-year analysis of interventions on rivers around the world, and they found that dams brought more water to 20% of the world's people, but decreased water to 24% of the world's people.
Nice.
So, this isn't magic water that like, well, we'll just get new water. It's coming from somewhere. It's coming from some critters. It's coming from some people. And the thing is, like, these kinds of interventions also don't necessarily benefit the receivers either. So, now we have a situation like in Southern California and the Southwestern US, where we have a population that is much larger than what the natural water available can support. And same with businesses and the types of agriculture we're practicing, like growing alfalfa and cotton in the desert, which are very water intensive. And so what happens is kind of creates this false sense of security, and you make these people more vulnerable to the water cycle, which is going to continue. Whereas many different cultures around the world, including many indigenous cultures, instead of seeing water as a commodity or a threat, which leads you to want to control it, they see water as a friend or a relative or as a collaborator. And they're looking at the systems in which water is a part. So water is, has its own agency, as we were talking about. It goes where it wants to go. It has relationships with the underground, with rock and soil, with microbes, with beavers, with humans. And so cultures that are taking into account those relationships and giving water the space to continue to conduct its various processes, not only has a better record with flooding and drought management, but also, support for biodiversity and providing food for humans as well as other critters, because so many important processes happen when water slows on land. And those slow phases, wetlands, floodplains, high altitude mountain forests, these are a lot of the places that we have eradicated with our development, basically just making our society much more brittle. So some of the people around the world that I visited are doing really different things. And just briefly, if a country, well, one place I looked at was the continent of Africa, because the population boom that's continuing this century is largely going to be in Africa. So you have cities that are needing to expand rapidly to accommodate many more people. And so in a way, it's an opportunity for leaders to think ahead and think, what could we do differently? How could we sidestep all these problems that Western development has created in the way that they relate to water?
And is there any particular example that comes to mind as sort of crystallizing the opportunity to leapfrog? This is an issue I've explored off and on. There's a lot of sort of leapfrog rhetoric out there, but then I see examples that seem to, whether it's pollution or development patterns, seems to be what's the word, replicative. They tend to stick with the existing models, colonial or otherwise, because they're there, this path dependency and
yeah, and that's true. And some of that is because money that's lent to develop, is lent by people who are doing it this way and say, like, you should do it this way. In some cases, formerly colonized countries sort of absorb the lessons of the colonizers and continue those patterns. And I won't say that anyone is, breaking away from that entirely, but in Africa, I chose to visit Kenya because Kenya had Africa's first water fund. So the idea there is linking upstream and downstream water users. And they even call the upstream people water producers and then the downstream people water users. So the water fund basically is like businesses and government agencies investing in people upland to help their practices conserve more water, and in that case also to keep more soil on the hillsides because there's a lot of erosion. But Kenya had, they revamped their constitution several years ago, including a new water law. And those were meant to sort of overcome some of these colonialist attitudes in various ways. And a couple of interesting things with their water law. They have a water towers authority. So water towers are highlands, and some billions of people, maybe 2 billion around the world, actually rely on mountains for their water. And that is true in Kenya. Kenya has several mountains that are more than 10,000 feet tall. And there are various climate and atmospheric reasons of why mountains sort of attract rain, and then river headlands begin in mountains. But the government, the national government of Kenya, has recognized that these water towers are a critical source of water. And they have this agency that is tasked with protecting these towers for all Kenyans. And, you know, there have been some controversial practices in terms of removing people who had moved in there to farm. And in one case, actually an indigenous group who hadn't moved in but had been there for a very long time. So, you know, it's not without, it's not perfect, but they are recognizing how hydrology works and trying to protect it. There's also a community users association program throughout the country, which again, like, lacks some funding, but this idea that a community can be responsible for its own water management, that a community on the ground is best placed to understand how much water is available to them and how they should share that water. That is an attitude that I found in many traditional water systems around the world. There's a communal sharing and caretaking of the water. And we just really don't have that in our dominant development. We have centralized systems where we are completely detached of both responsibility and agency in terms of our relationship with water. And so having the community involved really helps people understand the limits of the supply and how water works on a level that we just don't really have in modern development.
You're reminding me of my early reporting at the New York Times when I started there in 1995, 96 through 99. A big chunk of my beat was the New York City water supply, which of course was not in New York City. Eric knows this history, of course, particularly well. And I think you mentioned it in the book too. And it was very much about controlling the upstream, the tower being 2,000 square miles of watersheds north of New York City.
Yeah.
And the city had its own police force. And then finally, in recognition about the cost of having to filter increasingly polluted water, the city started to negotiate with people up there. And it became a bit more of a community engagement process than a community exclusion process. They moved cemeteries. So Eric, you know, when you think about cities with that kind of water history, what comes to mind?
Yeah, well, you know, everybody needs to drink, right? People, wildlife, all of us. Yeah, you know, there's a nice example of that in New York's historical ecology around the Collect Pond. You know, when you know, the Lenape didn't drink out of the Hudson River or the East River because, you know, they're an estuary, they're salty, so you can't drink out of them. And same for the Dutch when they came, and same for the English after that. But where they did drink in Lower Manhattan was the Collect Pond, which was this 80-foot deep pond that was fed by underwater springs that's kind of just north of where City Hall is today, kind of in Foley Square. And that was I mean, kind of okay. Actually, there was a law passed in 1731 about fishing in the Collect Pond because it was being overfished. And so they said no more nets, only like hook and line in the Collect Pond. People used to ice skate on the Collect Pond. Anyway, in the early American period, they allowed a leather tannery to set up shop. This is early 19th century on the edge, and leather tanneries, you know, make lots of nasty chemicals to treat the, you know, the leather and all the guts from the animals that they kill. Anyway, they just did what was the common practice, which was they just dumped it in the closest water body, which was the Collect Pond, which happened to be the fresh water source for this entire city, which was like completely idiotic. Even at the time, it was, I think they recognized how idiotic it was. Yes, there in Lower Manhattan. And it led to like
everywhere.
Yeah. If you zoom in a little bit, Andy, it's in the, you see that was like 3 arms of light green salt marsh. Below that. Yeah. Way downtown. There was like 66 miles of streams on Manhattan, you know, as a phone, and something like 600 miles of streams citywide historically. Anyway, they built over the thing. They knocked over a hill, which was it was called the Couch Hook. It was full of like Lenape shell mounds and shell middens. Anyway, they knock it over. fill it, and they built over the top. And there was actually a very short-lived square. Paradise Square was right on top of the collect pond. The problem was they didn't do a very good job, and so everything started subsiding, and it really stank. Like whole buildings would like sink into the mud, and it became the Five Points neighborhood, which was the incredible slum, like in modern people might know it for gangs in New York. But anyway, there's Charles Dickens came in like 1842, and he's like, I've seen slums in London. We have nothing as bad as this one that you have in New York, and it was right there on top of the collect pond. So in the Jacob Riis area toward the end of the 19th century, they, decided they would clear all the tenement houses, clear out the, all the poor people, and then build municipal buildings. And that's why like the New York courthouse is there, like the one you see at the beginning of Law and Order when the lawyers are walking up the steps. That's like right on the edge of the old collect pond, or, the federal prison, the federal building, the Tombs jail. It's all right on top of the old collect pond. And I've been told that the subway station that's also right where the collect pond is tends to still flood. And it was, to bring water into the city that actually led to the Croton Aqueduct system, which brought water from 40 miles north, that opened in 1838. The greatest act of hydraulic engineering since Roman times, they called it, right? To bring water all the way down. And that also affected the city. It created this high bridge, across the Harlem River. There was a big receiving reservoir in Central Park that they called Lake Mannahatta. There was another one, the distributing reservoir at 42nd Street, which is where Bryant Park and the public library are. Another one at Union Square. Anyway, all this amazing infrastructure. And then eventually they extended that to create the Delaware Catskill water system, which is where my water comes from.
So. Right. So one thing, we'll get back to the book in a second too. And then the turn of the hour, let's start to talk about the climate emergency more specifically with James Kunstler. And if you can stay on, that's great too. But I wanted to see, what have you found are ways to share these insights and deepen them in various places? I'm trying to think always about what we can do with this system we're all talking on now, the digital area. The one thing I loved about Eric, about your book was is this website and the fact that you're expanding it to the city. I did a conversation recently with Vivek Chandas at Portland State, who's developing a planning tool. He developed a planning tool for Portland that envisions futures for that city that are cooler or hotter, depending on how much green space there is, block by block by block. And I'm wondering, I wrote long ago, more than a decade ago, when Google was finally badgered to add the oceans, actual three-dimensional oceans, to Google Earth. They had this big gap, and Sylvia Earle, the great marine explorer, said, fill that gap, the oceans are there too. So have you talked, or are there people, Erica, you've met who are trying to kind of can get more normalize this possibility of everyone understanding better the landscape under them, the history and the future related to water and risk?
Yeah, I think so. Eric is a person who is fascinated with this and has helped to popularize this, but there are people doing similar work in cities around the world. And I think it is a great way to engage people, because I think most people have an innate curiosity about the place that they live and sort of a fascination with what it was like before they lived there and before humans so dramatically altered it. People also have an innate biophilia, love of nature. And so the thought of streams or, bears in their city, I think is a compelling one. And then many of the planners who are looking for ways to make space for water within human habitats are mapping the historical ecology and then the modern mapping, similar to what Eric did in his book. And then, you can kind of run test models through it and that also includes like the soil type, the vegetation type, height of buildings or size of building roofs, et cetera. So you can kind of find the pinch points, like where water is likely to flood and where you can create space for it. But I'm also, as the book is going out into the world and people are starting to read it, I'm being contacted by certainly like water utilities and an office of the EPA and people who are decision makers, but also people just, citizens in their town who really care about a particular creek or a particular shoreline, and they have questions about it. And, maybe they're involved in a community group that's trying to do something about it. So one thing I hope to do in the future is, well, certainly I think in the near future, I'm going to create a list of resources on my website of different groups and orgs who are advising people on these types of projects. But I think it could be neat also to make a forum to connect some of these people with each other so they can discuss ideas and best practices. And I really emphasize in the book that slow water solutions, as I call them, are bespoke. They're unique to each place. You can't just stamp them out cookie cutter because every place has unique geology, ecology, and culture. But there are some common themes and common strategies that I think people could share with each other. And the biggest thing is, I think, people who work with water are aware of these types of interventions and how important they are. And also that they should be distributed across the landscape as opposed to the centralized thing. So it is like looking upstream to the Catskills or looking to floodplains beyond the city, as well as looking for opportunities to move water into the land within the city. But I think it's an opportunity. You're talking about climate change in the next segment. And I think people feel really overwhelmed by climate change. We're sort of waiting for international governments to reduce emissions, which of course is critically important. But these types of slow water projects, what I was going to say is the distributed sort of like renewable energy, solar panels on everybody's roof, adding up to a significant amount of energy. When you think about all the space we've taken away from water, that's why you need like little small scattered projects. But these projects are something that people can do within their own communities to make themselves more resilient against climate change by absorbing flood and supplying groundwater to streams in dry seasons. And there's also a significant carbon storage element, the aspect of land use change, which is the ways in which we've disturbed the natural landscape, is about 25% of our emissions. And these natural ecosystems that people are looking to restore to better, heal the water cycle, store incredible amounts of carbon, whether you're talking about like mangroves, wetlands, et cetera. And so it's a way that people can have agency right at home to do something to both protect themselves and to try to reduce the impacts of climate.
And Eric, obviously you think about this in terms of expanding your project through the city. Is this a global conversation for you or WCS? I know WCS has that big climate adaptation with ecosystems in mind project and stuff. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I don't know how that happened. Yeah, we have a climate adaptation fund that's funded by the Duke Foundation that has given out a lot of money to try and build more climate resilient climate adaptation, both in wild systems and in some urban systems. I think one thing that's important to say is that, we only value something, it turns out, in a capitalist economy if you pay for it. And so, I think paying for water is really important. We pay for water in New York City, and that creates both the revenues that allow the water board and the Department of Environmental Protection to build the sewer infrastructure, but also to protect the watershed, as we were talking about before. And I think there's a lot of innovative things, at least in our case, our stormwater fee is based on our water consumption. So, if you actually break down your bill, and so if you use more water, you pay a little more because it's going into the sewer. That's the thought. But, other places, it's based on how much impervious surface you have on your property, right? If you pave your driveway, basically you're taking that permeable surface that would have absorbed water and you're making that water have to go into the storm drain, which then has to be treated.
Detroit is doing that.
Yeah, and Portland has a similar thing. I mean, there are these kind of things that give us a little nudge in the right direction. And you know, in a book I wrote a number of years ago, you know, I argued that if you actually valued ecosystems, this is what you would do too. You would not base your property tax assessment on the economic value of your property or only on the economic value, but also on its ecological value, using the historical ecology as a kind of proxy. Well, you mentioned, Andy, the work in Portland visioning. You know, we had this thing funded by the Rockefeller Foundation Cultural Innovation Fund called Vision Maker, visionmaker.nyc, which allowed you to zoom into any block in New York City and see its historical ecology, and then you could see a map of the current ecology, and then it had these painting tools. You could paint the different buildings, or paint different ecosystems, or paint back to the historical ecology. And create your own vision. The idea was to make people into vision makers, you know, who could share their visions, and it was all internet based. You could literally like make a vision and share the link with somebody else. And then it ran models. It ran a water model, an energy model, an economic model, and a biodiversity model. So you could actually see the consequences of your vision versus the way that part of the city performs today, the way it used to perform 400 years ago when it was a natural landscape. And, you know, with this idea of ecological democracy, because I kind of think there's no way, like you can't solve this sort of stuff through totalitarianism. You know, you have to do it kind of from the ground up, both because of the sort of local circumstances that Erica was talking about, but also because you have to have buy-in to actually make it work. And so, you know, the best landscape plans are the ones that are derived, you know, in close concert with the people that live there. As long as those people are thinking not just of themselves, but they're thinking about, you know, the world that they came from, the people before that created the world they live in, and they're thinking about the people that are going to come after. Because I mean, this is our big problem: is everybody solves their problem and just kicks the can on problems they can't solve to the next generation. And you know, we're in the 21st century where we're receiving all the cans, you know, that have been kicked down for hundreds of years, and it's causing us problems. Yeah.
I'm just showing another layer, of course. I love this website, nativeland.ca. I keep meaning to get the people who developed it, are still developing it, on a conversation. And it's essentially a map of indigenous history and current indigenous activity. You can flip from the names of Hoboken, or where I used to live, you know, Cold Spring becomes Lenape and territory. And I think I still would love to see a world where we have these layers they're just there to discover. I've talked to a couple of people at Google. You imagine if you're on Google Maps and you're driving somewhere and, you know, you're a little bored, the kid in the backseat, you know, you just want to click the history. And so, wow, this is where we are now. This is what it was in indigenous times. This is where the water was. And wow, there's houses there now. That's interesting. You know, there's so much that could be added. But it will take some of these big players, like they did with the Google Oceans, to do that. I've used Twitter off and on to say, hey, can we have some version of this native lands map as just a clickable, almost a second nature thing to look at on Google Maps? So hopefully someday.
And, you know, I mean, indigenous peoples have great lessons for water management too, because they had to survive, you know, before globalization with their landscape that they had available to them. And some of these techniques are now being recognized and appreciated by modern societies. So one story in my book is about Peru, and Peru is one of the most water insecure countries in the Western Hemisphere. It relies largely on glaciers to supply water to 2/3 of its population that lives on the desert plain, and those glaciers are melting, and some have melted. But Peru is one of 6 places on Earth where a complex civilization emerged, largely because they were motivated to finesse the water cycle, which was always like dry and wet. And so there's a technique in the mountains there called amunas, and amuna is a Quechua word that means to retain. And basically, it's a little canal built of rocks, and yeah, there's one. So when the river was running high in the wet season, they would divert some of the water into this canal, and route it to a natural infiltration basin. So that's like a little bowl on the side of the mountain that has porous soil, and the water would go in there and then it would move underground. And the benefit of that is that water moves downhill much more slowly when it's moving underground because it has to go through all the rocks and soil. And then it would emerge a little further down the mountain from a stream or a spring, and they would harvest it there and then use it to water their crops. So in this way, they were able to extend the water availability into the dry season. And this technique is about 1,400 years old. It was innovated by a people called the Wari. And their descendants live in the Andes today, and in at least 3 villages, they still practice this technology. And there's a communal program where they share the work of cleaning the sediment out of the canals each spring. They have blessing ceremonies, and then they have a water manager who that presidency changes every year, and that person is responsible for allocating equally the water that is available in a given year. So it's a communal system, and there's a recognition of the commons, which is important. But also they understand which infiltration basin feeds which spring, which is really remarkable. That means they understand the path that the water is taking underground. And this is knowledge that they have accumulated over generations and just passed down. And so now the utilities nationwide are required to invest in upstream natural infrastructure. So it's a recognition that nature is what provides the water. And that money is going to shore up these systems, which is working with nature. It's working with the underground, because they used to exist throughout the Andes. And they extend water availability to cities as well, because once the farmers water their crops, a lot of that water goes in the soil and eventually makes its way down to the rivers that supply the cities. So I think there's a lot to be learned from indigenous knowledge of a particular landscape and how water actually works, and the challenges for us in the dominant culture to appreciate it and to recognize its value.
Yeah, this is great. It's good to see that there are places where those intangibles become tangible, and the idea of investing in those upstream communities and ecosystems to sustain the downstream realities seems something that really should be spread widely. There have been some great questions. I see James Howard Kunstler is in the green room. There's some iced tea there, thanks for coming on. I'll have him come on in a couple minutes. He can come on now. This is all relevant to the long emergency.
I hope there's no blue M&Ms in the bowl.
No, I took those out. There was another speaker who insisted, so no blue M&Ms. James, are you up in Saratoga area? Or where are you?
I'm in the area. I moved about 15 miles east of that, on the other side of the Hudson River. I'm in a little factory village about 10 miles from the Vermont border.
Great. Yeah, I just departed from the Hudson Valley for the first time in 32 years, moved to Maine. But I'll always cherish that region.
Yeah, that's too bad. I'm sorry to see you go.
Yeah, well, I'll be back off and on, how it goes.
All right.
Well, we've been talking about water as a lens on the broader issues of sustainability and or crisis. Water is crucial. We're heading toward a planet with 9 billion people. The equity issue is everywhere. And as Erica was saying in her book, describes, the colonial, mercantile, capitalistic pattern that has spread is still shaping, even in many developing countries, how water ends up being conserved, polluted, shared or not shared. And Erica, we weren't talking even about, you mentioned, I forgot where, maybe it was Kenya. So many river basins cross national borders. I recently was writing about the Mekong, and big issues when water crosses borders is going to be another thing. And climate change on top of all this just is jolting everything in a one-way way. It's like a ratchet more than a jolt that leads to the long emergency that we'll talk about in a few minutes. Let me just see if we can squeeze questions. If that's okay. Well, Pippi Langkus earlier had said it's great to see landscape architects in this regard getting more play as not just gardeners. I spoke at a big meeting of landscape architects a few years ago and was thrilled to see them really thinking about, like, I'm not even going to get back to his name. McHarg. Yeah, Ian McHarg.
Good,
Who
Andy.
developed this 1960s, this pattern of working with communities to understand the geology, the hydrology, the biology, and then you can talk about your community. So landscape architects can play a really important role here, I think.
Well, they so often make landscapes, right?
Right.
That's their job.
Well, that's been transmuted into a whole new field of bullshit in the Harvard GDS by Charlie. No, I don't even remember his last name now. But, Ian McHarg was really just mostly about directing hydrological flows and nothing about doing good urban design. And so for 25 years, he kind of hamstrung the practice and teaching of urban design because, they were preoccupied with these matters of hydrology. And it wasn't until the new urbanists came along that the emphasis really got placed in the right things.
You mean social dynamics too, I assume.
Well, on how the built environment actually relates to human psychology, neurology, economy, and everything else that goes into the human project, not just the directional flows of water.
Yeah.
It's really only recently that that the field of hydrology has incorporated human impacts through sociohydrology, and the idea that you can't just look at flows because humans are having such a dramatic impact on flows, and the kind of social psychological aspects like the levee effect, which gives people a false sense of security, and that it's safe to build behind a levee, but then you have a more dramatic flood, which causes more damage because you have more people at risk, similar to the kind of reservoir effect that I was talking about earlier, with people relying on these unnatural giant pools of water that are, as we're seeing with Lake Mead, not a certainty.
Yeah. Hey, Andy, I'm gonna have to drop off. I have another thing at 2:00.
Okay, but Eric, it was fantastic to catch up with you, and let us know when you're ready for the next iteration of Wilikia and the citywide mapping project, because I love your work.
Yeah, it's great to see you, Eric.
Yeah, same here, Eric, and nice meeting you, James. Okay,
Have
a nice day.
It's been short but sweet.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Bye.
There's one actually, Eric. You know what? I'll have to ask him later. But Ramesh Longani, who's now at Brooklyn Poly and running the science program, he was wondering about Vision Maker, that teens program. Is that still running? I will ask Eric, Ramesh. It's great that you're here from out in the Midwest. So thanks for tuning in. Erica, can you stay on?
Yeah, I can stay for a little while.
Okay, because it's all interrelated: heat, water, the lack of water. And so, James, it's great to connect with you here. I think we did intersect, as I was saying earlier in a Twitter message, at a Shell-funded event long ago that the Aspen Institute put on somewhere. It was one of their
kind of a horrifying event.
Yeah, although it was interesting, that's been true in many of these events of that sort. That if you look at even Axios is funded by their sustainability news feed is funded by Enbridge, I think Enbridge. So we're surrounded by those layers as well. But James, you wrote about suburbia longer ago, and then in 2005 you wrote The Long Emergency.
Published it in 2005, yeah.
Well, right, 2005 published, and that I've got it on my shelf. It's still actually right now it's in a box because we just moved to Maine. But
there's going to be a quiz, Andy.
No,
have to dig it out again. Study
but
up.
You were describing at that point the issues were a little different. The oil abundance and availability question was sort of shaped differently than it is now. But the key idea, the converging catastrophes idea, that there's layers, dimensions of change that are intersecting and creating worse outcomes than they would individually, is so much back in that, I'm not sure how many people appreciate it, but as your book, are you resurgent now as a result?
Well, I had my 10 years of ignominy during the shale miracle, which now has been revealed as basically a financial stunt, although it did produce a lot of oil in a short period of time. Also, I've been having to contend with the tribulations of wokery, and have become a great enemy of the woked up. So, I'm perhaps on a different page.
Yeah. Well, everyone is dealing with some aspect of those issues too.
Mm-hmm.
Let's focus though on right now on both this intersection of water, energy, population, consumption, capitalism. Are you still as is it worse now in your respect than it was then? Tell us what you think. Actually, let's back up. Maybe I'll ask you both. Climate emergency is now very much in the headlines again. This is not new, but it's there. And I don't know if you could define, when you think of emergency, what that feels like. What's your sense of that word? Maybe Erica.
Are you asking me or Erica?
Well, let me ask Erica and then you.
I think we're an emergency, a climate emergency, water emergency, a biodiversity emergency. And I think the biodiversity emergency isn't getting nearly enough attention, but all of these things are linked. They are basically, pushing all of the natural systems that support us to the brink, to where, they are certainly undermining quality of human life, and in some cases, actual human life, people dealing from heat deaths, et cetera. I do think that development choices are a significant part of that, like we were discussing, and consumption, but population also. In my lifetime, the population of the world has increased from 3.5 billion to 8 billion. So things that were very extractive resource oriented that sort of worked to some extent, or something was depleted and you'd go somewhere else and get some more of it. Now with this many people, we're really pushing up against those boundaries. 75% of the world's land has been dramatically altered by human projects, which means that it's not functioning in the way that it's intended and is unable to supply a lot of what's needed to other critters, et cetera. And, I do think that capitalism is a fundamental part of that, because, we have all of these green businesses who are making words about, sustainability, et cetera. But sustainability is diametrically opposed to the goals of capitalism, which is, to make as much money as possible for the people at the top. It's not to make sure that everybody has enough, and so resources then are extracted to a point of kind of economic extinction, at which point, the goal is to go and find some replacement for it. And with global capitalism, that's even more kind of out of sight, out of mind, because, the extraction that's happening is so separated from the people who are consuming it typically. I think, there's a movement called the Deep Adaptation. And the idea is that societal collapse is imminent. They say like within a decade. And the idea is not to inspire panic, but to talk about what comes next and, what do we want to move toward. I'm not super optimistic that the power structure is going to allow significant change. But I do think that if we don't have, the latest IPCC report called for dramatic change in how we do basically everything, including the dominant economy and how we manage water. And if we don't, I think, life is just going to get much, much more unlivable for all of us. And we're already seeing that, with the wildfires and the floods and people dropping from the heat.
So James, emergency. I tend to embrace your definition as you described it. Then it's an emergent state of the planet in which we can never relax. That's the adaptation. Even the word adaptation seems to have a finality to it. You're adapting to X, as opposed to
well, animals, humans, plants, and living things are always adapting to the circumstances that reality is presenting. And I think that there's a key way of understanding our predicament that that I think many people who are discussing these matters fail to clue into. And I would just start with the proposition that climate changes are fairly constant in human history. We have the Roman warming, we have the end of the Roman Empire, Dark Age cooling, we have the medieval warming, you have the Little Ice Age, and that's just within the 2,000 odd years of really of modern history of civilization. And so we can easily imagine that there were similar cycles prior. Now, the difference is that we're living in a techno-industrial civilization that is so full of fragile interdependencies that we can't see any way to adapt, and we're not terribly interested in adaptation because we don't want to change any of the things we're doing. And so what that has prompted a number of things. One is a foolish sense of grandiosity that takes us away from our true business at hand, which is managing our communities and making us think that we can control things all over the world in all kinds of other places, which I think is something we got to just stop doing. And the other thing is this panic issue that Erica raised. In fact, I believe that behind the phenomena that Matthias Desmet defines as the mass formation psychosis has been the anxiety over the failures of industrial civilization and the imminent broken business model that we are now encountering. And that has prompted much of the hysteria and idiocy of the historical moment that we're in.
Yeah. There's a lot of terror there. I think you're talking including some of that passion that drove folks to Trump.
Well, what drove folks to Trump was the stupendous corruption of our permanent bureaucracy and the political parasitical parts of it that parts attached to it. And, I don't think that that's a hugely difficult metaphysical question. But I do think what's more interesting is the response to Trump, which has been a truly hysterical derangement. So that now, we're living in a political climate in which every boundary of reality has to be broken or shifted or changed. And every self-evident belief has to be erased. And that makes me very uncomfortable. I can only imagine that, the kind of people that I grew up amongst, namely East Side New York liberals, are even more psychologically disordered by it than I am.
Yeah, and right. There's more than one flavor of derangement, or maybe it's the same driving force, but it takes us in.
Well, there's a great deal of derangement out there, and mainly it's driving us into realms of action that are crazy, grandiose, and probably futile.
The futile part, well, we were talking earlier about, at least on an adaptation, I think on some energy issues, there's a lot that can be done at the local level that can build momentum toward federal change.
There's not going to be federal change. What you're seeing, one of the big components of the long emergency idea or body of ideas is that we're seeing exactly what I predicted 15 years ago. The federal government is becoming increasingly ineffectual, impotent, unable to discharge its obligations and duties, and it's only going to get worse. And in fact, what's known as the trust horizon is going to devolve downward, and people are not going to. They're all, these institutions are already broken and have already lost the credibility of many of the people in this country. So, I think it's silly to talk about what the federal government's going to do about these things. They're not going to do anything. This is a set of emergent problems, and you're correct to tie in the word emergency with emergent, because that is also a key to where we're going. This is an emergent process in which reality is going to have mandates of its own and is going to tell us and to some extent compel us to behave differently, whether we like it or not. And, there's going to be a lot of whining and hand-wringing over it. And that's one thing we're seeing right now. And I'll tell you something. We can't afford to be crybabies anymore. And that's mostly what we're doing.
So, Erica, maybe a reaction to this notion of inefficacy at the top, which I agree with overall, even more so at the global level, the idea of global governance, forget about it.
Mm-hmm.
But so what's your sense of where do you go and what do you think and do?
Well, I agree that trust in federal government, certainly in the United States, has been dramatically undermined. And, I look a lot at climate because that's one of my main areas of coverage. And certainly the US federal government has failed to act for at least 40 years, again and again and again, even in the most basic ways. And you do see much more action on the city level because, the cities are on the front lines. They are dealing with flooding, they are dealing with wildfire, and they have to do something. And there are groups of cities and mayors that get together and try to do something. And I think this kind of thing can have an impact. Like you look at energy efficiency in California in the 1970s. Some leaders at the California Energy Commission put dramatic efficiency requirements on appliances, such as refrigerators, for example. And because California is such a large market, all of the suppliers started complying with, with those efficiencies. And so as a result, we have much more efficient appliances. So that's a small example. But I do think, like in the water projects that I was looking at around the world, community agency, community buy-in, community collaboration is definitely a way in which people can set up much more healthy relationships with water. And, it's possible there are examples of that on a more kind of industrial scale. California passed the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in 2014, which required groundwater to be managed for the first time. And the way they were able to do that, because they didn't have the politics to get it done statewide, was for local people to manage their own water, forming these groundwater sustainability agencies. Now, the ones in question are largely led by big ag, as far as I understand it. So, and right now there's a lot of kind of wayward last minute pumping happening. But I think, these kinds of community oriented things, like where people actually see the reality on the ground, can work.
Yeah. So I wanted to ask you both if you've thought about, to me, there's two different questions related to climate emergency. One is there a climate emergency? Or to me, emergencies, plural. There's a vulnerability emergency behind a lot of what we think of as a climate emergency.
Right, because climate emergencies have been a constant in human history, and the problem is that we depend on so many complex interdependent systems that are going to ramify each other's failures that we simply can't adapt this current business model for civilization. And so we have to find another business model for civilization. The key to that is it's going to be smaller, finer, and more local. And we're going to have to downscale probably most of the things we do, including the grandiosity of our thinking. There are two kinds of grandiosity that are very visibly in operation these days. One is techno-grandiosity, the idea that we're going to tech our way through this, and that includes a whole folder of things like replacing all the gasoline cars with electric cars.
Right.
Forget about it. Ain't going to happen. Or, putting up
It is
these,
happening.
yeah, forget about
Very
it. It's not going to
slowly.
happen on the mass basis. And I'll tell you exactly why. Because it's not the issue is not what powers the car, believe it or not. The issue is that Americans are used to buying cars on installment loans, and the middle class is now getting so crushed that fewer and fewer Americans can qualify for loans for cars that are increasingly expensive. And the automobile industry is at the end of its rope for creating new innovative ways for people to stretch out the financing. So that ain't going to happen. And
I disagree with that, actually. Norway already has like 40% of new sales electric, and they were one of the
Norway
first
has a
countries
huge
to
amount of hydroelectric.
They were one of the first countries to set targets, and many.
And they
many
also
other
have only
countries
6 million people.
India has set a target for phasing out electric cars, I think by 2030, 2040, China as well. So, it is happening. And yes, electric cars are expensive, but the costs are coming down and they continue to come down. Yes,
No,
where
they're
the
not.
energy comes from is an issue, but also, that is getting, as the costs of wind and solar come down, more and more energy that's supplied is renewable. And for me, the thing that I worry about with the expansion of electric cars, which I absolutely believe is happening, is battery and the kind of rare earth issues and the environmental impacts of that, which I don't think have been significantly addressed at this point.
There's one aspect of the
It's
market.
not going to work out.
Yeah, I'm pretty much a skeptic on this too. The market issues. I can't remember who. A woman at Grist wrote a great story recently.
Well, this is exactly the kind of techno grandiosity that I'm describing.
I am
Well,
definitely not a
the
techno
story-
grandiose person. I absolutely
No, you absolutely are.
I
You
grew up
absolutely
in,
are.
I
You
grew up in
represent it
Silicon
perfectly.
Valley, and I have definitely seen all kinds of hype that doesn't play out. But I think, often these problems are kind of like short-sighted, single-focused problem solving. So I definitely don't believe technology will save us. But I do think that, I've been reporting on renewable energy and electric cars for 20 plus years, and there's been a lot of movement in that time.
The one thing I just wanted to add to this was Sharon Osaka and others have written about the market. While everyone is offering an EV in the mix of their cars, the EVs that are being sold, the ones that people are actually buying, are at the luxury end of the spectrum. So it's sort of supporting James's thought that the idea of a Ford style EV for everybody, it seems to be still.
Yeah, the mass motoring part is the important part.
Yeah.
This can't be just some luxury thing for 0.1% of the population.
Yeah, but
Because when it ceases to be democratic, that's the end of it.
I agree that we need to move away from independent cars.
And also this gets back to I don't know if it was your first book, James, the one on suburbia.
Geography of Nowhere.
Yeah, I've focused on the work of in Georgia. She wrote about dead malls, reviving malls.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, Galena.
She has a hyphenated name. Anyway, reinventing suburbia.
Oh, Ellen Dunham Jones.
Yeah. Reinventing suburbia is going to take time too.
We're not going to reinvent it. It has three destinies: slums, salvage, and ruins. And if you will allow me to describe how this is going to work, the suburbs are toast. The business model for suburbia is completely broken. We just don't know it yet. Our cities are going to contract enormously and substantially. They occupy important geographical sites, so something is going to be there, but they're going to be a lot smaller than they are now. And there are going to be huge battles over who gets to occupy the districts that retain value. And the action is going to move to the smaller towns and smaller cities across America that have some meaningful relationship with agriculture. And we're going to see the beginning of that this year. You know, we're close to the point where the desert Southwest may have to be, you might almost say, evacuated. You know, if the situation, this quandary with the Lake Mead and Hoover Dam and you know, the Colorado River continues to worsen.
The desert Southwest doesn't need to be evacuated, but we do need to stop growing cotton and alfalfa. And
well, I'm not. Look, I'm aware of the fact that that word is a bit of.
There are too many people there for the
exaggeration,
amount of water that's available.
But they're going to be in a lot of trouble. A lot of people are going to be leaving there probably within the next 12 months. And where are they going to go? They don't know, you know. But I would say that we have to reconsider something very important. First of all, the inland waterway system of America is tremendously important. We're probably going to have to move a lot of people, or not, at least a lot of goods on water when the trucking system fails, which it's in the process of doing now. And that's one of the converging catastrophes that Andy mentioned.
And that's a labor issue too, right?
It's a labor issue. It's a policy, you know, it's an environmental policy issue, and it's an oil issue, you know, a petroleum issue. It's a manufacturing issue. It's a supply chain issue. It's all, you know, all of these systems, all of these complex systems are interlocked, and they're, you know, they, as I said, they ramify each other's failures. And so the inland waterway system is terribly important. It happens to, most of it tends to be east of the Mississippi River, and, you know, includes the Mississippi, parts of the Missouri, the Great Lakes, the Hudson River estuary, the Erie Canal, the Champlain Canal, you know, and many other waterways, the Ohio River. And those are some of the cities and towns in that part of the country are among the most disinvested in America, and the most beaten up. And they're going to retain a tremendous amount of, they're going to regain a tremendous amount of value. A lot of people are going to be moving there. The Great Lakes are a tremendous asset. And the land around the Great Lakes, especially, you know, the state of Michigan, is tremendous agricultural land. But, you know, on the whole, I think we're going to see a lower population in the United States, perhaps substantially lower. Our cities are going to shrink, and the action's moving to the small towns where there's water and agriculture.
So maybe a little bit of prediction from Erica on, if you look at the landscape, you know, we have a wetter northeast, a drying southwest, and other parts. We have demographic trends that so far are still moving more people into regions of heat and water stress and flooding than in the opposite direction. You know, what would be the ideal, if you were going to re-report your story in 2040, your story in your book, like what would be the best case scenario?
Okay. I'll answer, and then I'm going to have to step off. Thank you so much.
This has been great.
Thank you for having me, and pleasure to meet you, James. So, I mean, the trends that I was seeing in my reporting is, in fact, rural areas have been on a dramatic depopulating trend. And a lot of that is because some of the areas that were being farmed were quite marginal in various ways. And so, you know, as the economics of farming become more and more difficult with less government support, you know, people are choosing to move to cities for other opportunities. And, you know, that can be an opportunity for helping protect cities' water supplies, like we were talking before. You know, if you can return that marginal farmland to floodplains so that, you know, the river has a space to go when it's running high. Certainly the Great Lakes are a really important source of fresh water. And, they're dealing with rising lake levels right now and some property damage as a result. I do think, there's probably going to be a trend of people moving toward more water-rich areas. But interestingly, like the rainfall patterns, rainfall is actually increasing across the United States, including in the Southwest. 10% more rain than like from the 1950s. So the issue is that, you're getting more of it at once and then longer drought periods. And as I was talking about in the previous hour, definitely these giant dam infrastructure projects, which were built kind of a desire of the federal government to settle the West and to kind of claim it, as opposed to a real understanding of how hydrology and agriculture work in that area, have attracted more people to settle there than the area can really support from a water perspective, and making more people and more businesses vulnerable to the water cycle. So I do think there will be people leaving drier areas and moving toward wetter areas. I don't think there's going to be a mass exodus. And the important thing to remember about all these drought hype stories is that, I mean, the drought is real. So I don't mean to insinuate that it's not. But the drought is impacting people because we have so many misuses of water. There's a huge amount of room to conserve. California, 70% of water goes to agriculture, and worldwide, California is 80%. Worldwide, it's about 70%. And so much water is going to uses that are so dramatically subsidized and benefiting a very, very tiny percentage of people. So what we need is a dramatic reallocation of water rights. And that has been politically extremely difficult, but it is possible. Australia did it in the aftermath of the Millennium Drought. And, it's still kind of shaking out in terms of how effective it is. But, the way that we have been doing things is not sacrosanct, and it can change. And on that note, I'm gonna have to sign off. But Andy, thank you very much for having me, and I've really enjoyed this talk.
Wonderful to reconnect with you, and good luck getting the book out and around. Slowwater.world is the website for your project.
That's right.
Erica Gies, great to see you from Victoria, BC. The
Thank
last
you.
time I was there, one of the things I wrote about was the rabbit population explosion on the campus of the university. But I think
that was a pretty funny story. So just quickly, they decided that the bunnies couldn't be at University of Victoria anymore. And by the way, these were pet rabbits that people released on this, lush campus, not wild rabbits. So when the university banned them, they lived on this little freeway margin. And so you're driving down the freeway and you see all these bunnies there. And after a while, they had to put, no stopping for bunnies signs, because it was actually a freeway hazard. And so that went on for a few years. And then the bunnies were relocated to a farm in Texas. So I don't know if that's actually true, but yeah.
I'll have to do a follow-up.
Yes.
They probably were coyote bait. Thanks again. This is great.
Yeah.
Great
Thank you, Andy. Take care. Bye, James.
And James, if you could stay on a couple more minutes.
Yeah, sure.
This issue of the brittleness issue is a real thing. And
you bet.
It's not just the physical systems, it's the political systems too. I share I'm kind of like, I still think of myself as Rene Dubos talked of a despairing optimist. Mm-hmm. That I'm not seeing complete collapse. I'm seeing lots of opportunity for us to function.
Well, I'm not seeing a return to the Stone Age, but I do see. I think we're gonna be taking a time out from the technological orgy for a while.
I think, especially the supply chain issues and things. There was this one hilariously weird moment on Bill Maher, where he was making a pitch for building giant pipelines. He was saying he pretended he was a meteorologist, and he said he seriously went into this where we have too much water in the east, not enough in the west. Let's build some pipelines to carry it all through the Rocky Mountains. And there were serious people writing about this, Henry Miller and others. And it reminded me of folks at the University of Alabama who I contacted years and years ago, who said, just get rid of the salad bowl of America should be down here, not over there. Like, end the ridiculous subsidies. Unfortunately, they're historic. You know, the building of those dams, Erica talked about the early 20th century. It's not like ending a subsidy. It's a giant system.
Well, it's kind of a subsidy. There are many ways of thinking about it.
Harder to end than an administrative subsidy.
Well, they have their own beginning and middle and end, and that is that dams silt up, and also all the technology within them, the turbines and everything else that moves, that has to open and close, let water in and out. All that stuff gets old, and so they have a limited lifetime. We make the mistake of thinking that the 20th century, which is really the reference point for a lot of people like you and me, that was normality, when in fact it was an absolutely abnormal phase of human history. And we're now getting into something quite different and quite unstable, and naturally that freaks people out. But I think the human project is going to continue, but it's going to continue, at least for a while, as far ahead as we can see, at a lower pitch. And I want to point something out to you.
Sure.
I mean, obviously, I got a chip on my shoulder about some of this stuff, and I'm kind of hyper combative about it. But between you and me and the doornail, I feel like Americans have been fucked around for much of the last 20 years, and especially the last 5. And one of the governing ideas that is simply false out there, that I see throughout educated PhD America, is this idea that if we can measure everything, we can control it.
Yeah.
And that's sort of their fundamental belief. And it's just not how the universe works. No. And this mania for measuring everything and showering us with statistics about everything, it sounds all grown up and advanced, but it's really kind of a delusion. And it leads us into down this path of grandiose thinking, that that we can do more than we think.
Well, especially, I don't know if you saw just the last 24 hours, there was a paper that came out that two different people have done sort of a meta-analysis of the science of nudging, and essentially it's what they call publication bias, meaning you don't see negative results in journals. Mm-hmm. When you take away the publication bias, we don't know that nudge works. And it was a best-selling concept. It's built into a lot of behavioral and communication stuff.
Yeah, but we're also living in an age of incredible propaganda, mindfuckery, and other attempts to influence our thinking that are nefarious. So you got to be very careful about what people are retailing in the way of thought. And we can, in the meantime, we can see what's actually happening in the world. And what's actually happening is the world is becoming more disordered. And among them, the disorders of what we call capitalism. I have to say, capitalism is generally treated as though it were a belief system, when in fact, all it really is a way for civilizations to manage their accumulated wealth. And we're always going to live in a world where some people have more stuff than others, and that'll be wealth. Whether it's one more ox than the next guy, or 3 more wives than the next guy, or an acre more land, whatever it is, there'll be surplus wealth. There'll be people with more than others. And so, but we're now in this this hamster wheel of equity, where we're pursuing this idealistic notion that we're going to level the entire global playing field, and it's never going to happen. And the disorders of capitalism are going to take it where it deserves to go for the moment, which is a pretty severe rearrangement of the terms and values of things. And we've been playing games with capital and with capital formation and money for 25 years or so in a really bad way, and that is on the verge of sorting itself out too, along with an awful lot of other things.
Well, one way or the other, you and I will see less of what comes of this than most people on the planet who are a lot younger than us now.
Well, we're going to have to sort out how we produce food.
Yeah.
Industrial agriculture is in the process of failing now. I mean, we can see it with, shortages of fertilizer and diesel fuel, and exactly how that works to disorder the entire system, including the relation of trucking to the agriculture system. We can see the disorders of transportation, of being able to get around. Our living arrangement is entirely disordered. We're living in cities that have assumed a scale that is simply not sustainable, and it won't be sustained. They're going to, as I said a few minutes ago, they're going to have to get smaller. And this obsession with of wanting everybody to move into cities and turn the entire population into a group of people sitting around drinking lattes, and working on their laptops remotely, is childish. It's not going to happen. In fact, Americans are probably going to have to work a lot harder, and many of them are going to be working at things that are physically demanding that they never expected. A whole generation of kids who thought they were going to be in the marketing department of the Gap, are going to find out that they're actually in the hoeing department of a local soybean farm or something like it. So, we're entering a phase of history that's going to include a lot of hardship and a lot of tribulation.
Well, on that note, it means The Long Emergency is still a highly relevant book to those who haven't read it. And you had a subsequent book, Living in the Long Emergency, I believe, right?
I had a couple, several. Hold on a second.
Yep.
I can't talk to you on a podcast.
And
I published a book in 2012 called Too Much Magic, and the subtitle was Wishful Thinking, Technology, and the Fate of the Nation. And we're living in that wishful thinking phase right now, on the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross transect of grief, despair, acceptance, etc. So unfortunately, the one thing that I did not really imagine would happen in my book, The Long Emergency, was that the country would go as crazy as it did. And now here we are, and look who's the president of the United States.
And we're turning to him to solve the climate emergency.
Yeah, right.
What do you have your own take on National Emergency Act as a tool?
It's a tool. It's just a tool for more, coercion, the pretense of being able to control things that can't be controlled. And here's the thing behind. I was a registered Democrat for probably, I don't know, since George McGovern ran for president in 1972, over 50 years, half century. But I don't consider myself a Democrat anymore. The left now really has one basic purpose: to coerce the population and to punish their adversaries as sadistically as possible. That's what animates them. The rest of it is just ideological window dressing and horseshit. And this is part of it. And Joe Biden is a hollow, empty suit front man for that program. And, it's an extreme psychological reaction to the disorders of industrial society. And it's very unfortunate. It's very unfortunate, especially that the thinking class in America is the most afflicted by it. And they have disgraced themselves and dishonored the institutions that they belong to, whether they're doctors or PhDs in the universities, and or bureaucrats in the federal bureaucracy. And that's really what's creating most of our problems for the moment, apart from just the environmental and economic disorders of the long emergency.
So Ramesh, who again, he's at Brooklyn Polytech in the city, he's an educator. Speaking for his students, I think in part, he's asking a final question, which I think is a good last question for you. So is this...
It's a kind of a
all of
rhetorical
our systems
question.
are collapsing. How do we move forward? What do you just...
It's a kind of rhetorical question because anybody who pretends to be intelligent and thinks about it for a few minutes will understand what we're in and what our quandaries are, and the fact that there are a lot of these predicaments to which there are no quote solutions. There are intelligent responses. One of them is, if you're a young person, realize that you've got to be real careful about finding a place to plant your flag that is going to be a favorable place to live, because there are going to be an awful lot of places in America that will not be favorable places to live, whether it's Phoenix or some country place in New Mexico, or there are a lot of places that are not going to be worth living in, and you got to be very careful about that. If you're a young person, you could recognize that the predicaments we face also present tremendous opportunities to find a vocation and a career, a way of life. For example, in rebuilding the local and regional networks of commerce that we're going to need to replace the bullshit of Walmart and the 12,000 mile supply line between Chinese factories and the Walmarts of America. We're going to have to revive American commercial networks. We're going to have to produce some things in this country anymore. We have no idea how we're going to do it. It will probably involve water power in one way or another, whether it's hydroelectric or even possibly direct water power. We may be making things in a more primitive way than we used to, but there are still opportunities in all of those things. And so I refuse to join in the general hand-wringing, and crybaby activity that we're seeing out there.
That's good. You reminded me, the last thing you reminded me of is Nathaniel Johnson, who used to be a journalist at Grist, writing about food futures and climate. He's now an electrician.
Oh, well, yeah.
He's studying to be a master electrician. He's working as an apprentice with an electrician,
Yeah,
installing a lot of basic systems in the Bay Area that he never thought about a few years ago.
That's an honorable trade. And,
Yeah.
it's direct and, it's doing something useful. I'm not 100% convinced that the electric grid is going to be very reliable in the years ahead. That's another thing that many people don't understand. All of our assumptions about running things on the internet, whether it's Bitcoin or anything else, people don't seem to be aware of the fact that the electric grid, which is the largest machine in the world, is extremely fragile and has pretty poor prospects for remaining reliable. And that includes the internet along with it, because without the electric grid, you're not going to have an internet. And so I find a lot of these things kind of laughable. But I also wrote a series of 4 novels after Too Much Magic. I wrote these 4 novels set in a small town like the one I live in upstate New York, after the collapse of an industrial civilization, namely the American industrial civilization. And, what I found was that there's a lot of appeal in living in the aftermath of that. And, having lived beyond the miserable distractions of the digital age and the mind fuckery that goes along with it. And living in a world that is beginning to ecologically restore itself, because there are so many fewer people messing it up. And I think that I sincerely believe that that's really the world that we're moving into. That series was the World Made by Hand series, and there were 4 of them in all. And they're out there. The usual suspects sell them.
Yeah. I'm showing that right now. Well, thanks so much for being here today. It's a Friday. We have to be realistic about the state of the world and where we go. I tend to think there are folks at EASA, this center in Austria, that has done a lot of modeling. Of course, it's just modeling, that point to trajectories toward a world of roughly 3 billion people by the year 2300. Without a hard knock between now and then. So I'm wondering if there is a way for this cresting set of waves to sort of slosh more than break. But I don't.
Yeah,
have
that would be
any-
nice. It would be nice if we could, have a softer landing, of course.
Well, we'll see. Thanks for all your writing. Thanks for all you do. Thanks for your provocations.
Well,
it's good to be jolted and think.
I'm
about
always there if you need more.
Good. All right. Thank you. Have a good weekend
Andy.
on that note. And thanks, everybody. This is Andy Revkin at the Columbia University Climate School, wrapping a long, crazy, hot week focused on climate emergency questions. Go to my dispatch. You can subscribe to it anytime. This was one of the pieces I did suggesting that the absolutists in the climate movement who block highways could keep one lane open at least if they want to have some support for what they're doing. And just sort of keep at it each day, reach out to somebody, learn something new, experience something different, and go forward. Take care.
Bye, Andy.